Jean and Maggie, Part 1. Nobody saw it coming. Walter Phillips was a hard-working man who thought through things and always had a plan. He'd learned from experience to prepare for the worst. It was bound to show up someday. It always did. Walter went to work as a farm hand in 1935, right about the time Germany was beginning to believe they could take over the world. He was 21 years old. He'd worked on his family's farm in Madison County, Iowa, till they nearly lost it at the height of the Depression. Selling it for 40 cents on the dollar got him out of debt, but it left their youngest son without a job. Like always, he figured out how to make it work. He always seemed to be able to do that. After hearing a friend say he'd found work on the R.W. Childs farm in Adair County, Walter borrowed his father's car and drove there the next day. He'd worked for Mr. Childs until 1942, when he's called up by the draft to serve in the war. Nearly 6 years of training with Mr. Childs, a man he respected who saw some of himself in this fine young man, helped make Walter the innovative thinker he would always be. He met Magdalena Rose Jensen in March 1939 at a Saturday night square dance in Greenfield, about 5 miles from Mr. Childs' farm. Walter loved to dance, but he was an even better fiddle player. Handsome, too. Whether on stage or on the dance floor, he knew how to have fun, and nearly every girl in town had her eye on him. Maggie took the challenge, and she won. Living in the area all her life, Maggie had seen Walter in town. He was 7 years older than her, so he never looked back when she looked his way. But in 1939, Maggie was 19 years old, no longer a child. It took time for her to grow into the woman who would catch his eye, and when she did, she made sure he remembered who she was. Maggie didn't wait for him to ask her to dance that night. She marched right up to him, her chin held high, her bright blue eyes sparkling. "Walter Phillips, you've been fiddling for these girls long enough. Now let's see if you can keep up with me on the dance floor." Walt's grin was like the sun creeping up over a field, slow and certain. He tipped his hat and said, "Well now, Miss Jensen, let's find out." That night they spun and stomped until the fiddler's arm gave out. By the time the music stopped, Walter had her hand in his and her laugh all tangled up in his heart. That's how Maggie did things, full force, no apologies. Peter, her father, had lived in Iowa more than 30 years, long enough to sound like an American farmer most days. But every now and then his Danish cadence slipped into his words, reminding folks that part of his heart still belonged to the country he'd left behind as a young man. He grinned at Walter, warning him, "That girl is full of piss and vinegar. She's a feisty one who don't mind a good tussle to prove her point. Best you know what you're getting into, son." At first, that was what made everything so exciting. Walter was the quiet type, and Maggie just the opposite. They were married on November 29th, 1940. Maggie threw herself into marriage the same way she threw herself into everything else, with full determination and not a lick of doubt. Walter thought she's the strongest woman he'd ever known, but even he couldn't have predicted just how much she'd have to bear. They lived with her parents while Walter split his time between the Childs' farm through the week and his in-laws' farm at night and on the weekends. The plan was to save their money and buy their own farm in a year or two. Life was good. A year later, Pearl Harbor threw our country into war, and 5 months after that, on April 30th, 1942, Walter was inducted into the Army Air Corps as a staff sergeant. He'd leave Greenfield to lead a team of fellas who had a knack for working on machinery. Only now they wouldn't be fixing tractors and combines. They'd be building and repairing B-17 bombers at MacDill Army Air Base in a place called St. Petersburg, Florida. Maggie wasn't about to let Walter go to Florida without her, but it wasn't just love that drove her determination. Maggie had never set foot outside the state of Iowa, and the idea of traveling to some place as exotic as Florida set her heart racing. She packed her bags with more excitement than Walter had ever seen, talking about palm trees and ocean waves like she'd already been there. I'm your wife, Walter, but I'm not just tagging along to keep house, she declared. I've spent my whole life looking at cornfields. I want to see something new. Besides, you'll need me down there. Who else is going to make sure you don't forget to eat? When Maggie left Iowa, her younger brother Darrell was just about 10 years old, running around the farm with his best friend Jean like a couple of colts fresh out of the barn. Jean's family lived in Grinnell, nearly 100 miles away, close to Maggie's grandparents, and since these boys became friends as toddlers, they found ways to spend time together whenever they could. Herbert, Jean's daddy, drove a delivery truck part-time, and when he was driving anywhere near Greenfield, Jean came along with plans to see Darrell. Maggie barely noticed him, too caught up in the whirlwind of leaving Iowa and starting this new chapter with Walter. But by the time she returned 3 years later, Darrell and Jean were nearly 15. Their lanky boyhoods were gone. Jean especially had grown tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence that could almost make you forget he was barely old enough to shave. From the spring of 1942 until September 1945, when the war ended, Walter and Maggie made a life for themselves in St. Pete on 7th Street under Florida's royal palms and moss-covered oaks. Walter worked long hours on the base, building and repairing planes to keep the war effort alive. Meanwhile, Maggie found a rhythm in a city far from the farmlands of Iowa, making friends with other wives who had come from places like Omaha, Nebraska, Youngstown, Ohio, and Boston, Massachusetts. They were more used to digging out of a February snowstorm than building sandcastles on the beach. Together they soaked up the sun as a faraway war changed the world. Walter loved the work he did, but it was the evenings he enjoyed most, sitting with his wife on the porch and dreaming about the future. For those few years, life was sweet and easy, just like the breeze that drifted through their home. When I was a kid, the only time I heard Daddy talk about something that made him truly happy was when he remembered his time in St. Pete. But in 1951, 6 years past the joy of newlyweds living their best life in the Florida tropics, the worst would come knocking on the door in Iowa. When the war ended in 1945, connections made with new friends from around the country and around the world had to end as well. Everybody packed up and went back to wherever they'd come from. Maggie hadn't realized how much she'd missed the sunshine until she's back in Iowa, with early September rain pelting the windows and the cold seeping into her bones. When she left St. Pete in September, it was still hot, but she had barely unpacked her suitcase before she was looking for her heavy sweaters. She tried to hold on to the happiness she knew in Florida, but the quiet of farm life wouldn't let her. Walter brought her home in their four-door sedan. He was on a 3-week furlough and would return to Florida at the end of the month to finish up his duties at the base. He would be home again, this time for good, right after Thanksgiving. But before he left, they received word from Darrell that the James Mackey farm would be up for sale in the spring. When so many men went off to war, Darrell and Jean quit school to start work in town at the co-op. At 14 or 15 years old, they were too young to join up, but old enough to work sunup to sundown. Along with another dozen boys, the co-op provided rooms for them to sleep in, built for just this reason, and board at the diner across the street. If you were going to hire teenagers and you expected them to show up for work every morning, you have to keep an eye on them. Money in their pockets would burn a hole trying to get out if they didn't have some guidance. After Darrell caught wind that the Mackey farm was about to go on the market, he and Jean came home to share the news with Walter. When Maggie stepped out onto the porch and saw him walking up the path, she did a double take. Darrell still had that same boyish energy, but Jean, the boy she remembered, was gone. Now he carried himself like someone older than his years, and it caught her off guard. The last time she'd seen him, he was just a boy running around with Darrell. Now he looked like he belonged alongside the grown men. The talk that evening circled around the farm, what Walter knew of the land, and whether it was worth taking a look. It didn't take much convincing. The next day, Maggie's parents joined Walter and their daughter to make the 12-mile journey to Orient, Iowa, and the Mackey homestead. While the Jensen farm was the first one outside Greenfield city limits, the Mackeys were about as far south from town as you could get and still be in the county. Maggie's father, Peter, knew this place well. The Mackey family had farmed this land for more than 100 years, ever since arriving from Ulster, Northern Ireland in the mid-1800s. Now, James Mackey was the last of his line. He and his wife Elizabeth had raised 3 sons here, but war had taken them all. The oldest died in the Pacific in 1942 when his aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown, sank at the Battle of Midway. The second fell in North Africa at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943, where the Germans handed the Americans their first major defeat. Their youngest, the surprise child born when James was 50, was barely 18 when he landed on Normandy Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and never made it home. James had been proud of his boys, proud of their service, proud of the country they died for, but he was tired. Nearly 70 now, he and Elizabeth were ready to move to town with their spinster daughter, Mary Beth. There were too many ghosts on this land. After touring the farm and spending time at the kitchen table with James and Elizabeth, it didn't take long for Pete to nudge Walter toward making an offer. Before the farm was even on the market, earnest money was exchanged, and a handshake sealed the deal. The papers would be drawn up and ready to sign come spring. Until then, Walter would work alongside Mr. Mackey on weekends, getting the lay of the land. It was everything he'd hoped for. On September 20th, Walter left Iowa for his final trip to Florida. Without him, Maggie's world felt emptier than she'd expected, and the days stretched long and lonely. She told herself it was just the weather, but that restless feeling inside her would not settle. She kept busy helping her mother with the chores and chasing her little sister around the house, but nothing filled the quiet like Florida had. Knowing she'd have her own home soon was exciting, but it still felt a long way off. Daryl and Jean stopping by nearly every evening after work was a welcome distraction. Their laughter filled the kitchen while Maggie made coffee, the house feeling a little less empty. Jean had shot up since she'd last seen him, his boyhood all but gone. Maggie found herself more aware of him than she meant to be. Daryl had picked up a second job at the hardware store and often left Jean to finish whatever task they'd started together. He'd help Maggie carry wood or feed the livestock while they talked about nothing and everything all at once. Somewhere in those evenings together, Maggie became Mags. It felt so natural they hardly noticed it happening. She was enjoying his company more than she should have, even when she told herself it was harmless. She knew better. They were playing a dangerous game, and she felt the pull of it stronger every day. But the excitement of listening for his boots on the porch was irresistible. The whole thing just kind of snuck up on her, and before she knew it, she was in up to her neck. Walter and Maggie had been married 10 years to the day when she delivered her second son, Evelyn Lee, in 1950. His older brother, Leland, had turned 4 in July, 4 months earlier. Right from the start, it was clear this new baby wasn't going to have an easy go of life. I mean, just look at that name. Why in the Sam Hill, Walter's favorite minced oath, would you name your boy Evelyn? I never knew where it came from, and when I asked, which I did plenty of times, I was ignored. By the time I sat down to write it all out, that poor boy's name was one skeleton that would never make its way out of the closet. A few weeks after Evelyn's birth, it was clear Maggie was very sick. It had started a year earlier, the day after Christmas in 1949, when Maggie came down with the flu, or at least that's what everyone thought it was. Her low-grade fever, body aches, and fatigue hung on longer than expected, and her cough never fully left her, not even when spring came. The first 3 months of 1950 had seen extreme weather conditions that only made Maggie's slow recovery harder. It was one of the worst winters she and Walter had ever lived through. Severe blizzards and constant snowfall created enormous snowdrifts that swallowed up fence posts and trapped whole communities. The entire state of Iowa, the whole Midwest for that matter, shivered under a thick blanket of snow and ice. Travel was nearly impossible in some areas, and food and medical supplies had to be airdropped into stranded farms. It didn't get quite that bad on the Phillips farm, but the daily burden kept Walter on edge, always on guard. He fought against snow and sub-zero temperatures that threatened his livestock and outbuildings, making sure the animals had enough food and water, battling frozen pipes and frostbitten hands filled his days. He'd been doing this work for years, but this winter tested him like none other. Everybody's life was at risk, human and animal alike, and it wasn't just the physical toll either. The weight of it all, the endless fight to keep roads around the farm clear, the long hours spent seeing to the livestock, the constant worry over Maggie's health, it all drained him. By the end of the day, Walter barely had the strength to fall into bed. Some nights, he was too tired even to eat. Maggie's 3-year-old son, Leland, required much of her time and energy. Household chores and helping Walter with the farm during such extreme weather would have been difficult in the best of times. When Maggie got sick, it was more than she could manage, and Walter could see the cracks. Maggie'd been through hard times before, but this was different. The fire that had burned so brightly in her had dimmed, flickering against a cold wind she couldn't fight. Walter watched her in the kitchen, his brow furrowed. The worry set deep in his bones. Maggie brushed off his concerns like she always did, saying she's fine, but he knew better. The truth was, the Maggie he'd married, the Maggie who marched right up to him and demanded a dance, was fading away, and he didn't know how to stop it. He had to find a way to help her. Walter still believed hard work and determination could fix most things. He had no way of knowing that some troubles had already slipped beyond his reach.